Hello and welcome to a new episode of A Brief History Spooky Season. Today's episode is brought to you in collaboration with the members of my annual Hell House Collab, where we build our favorite houses from spooky books, movies, and TV shows. You can find their videos in the description box below. In today's episode, we are traveling to Rhode Island in the 1970s to discuss a family of 7 who experienced overwhelming paranormal activity in their home, known as the Arnold Estate, over the span of a decade. From objects moving around on their own, to disembodied voices, to the smell of rotting flesh, the family grew more and more concerned about what was happening in their house, leading them to reach out to the famed demonologists Ed and Lorraine Warren. The Warrens visited the home frequently in the 1970s, but ultimately did nothing to help the family. This is a brief history of the PERRON family haunting. As always, this episode of A Brief History may contain graphic content and is not suitable for all audiences. Viewer discretion is advised. In this episode, we are building the home from the Conjuring movie rather than the real-life home. If you would like to see a recreation of the real-life home, please leave a comment below. The original home in Rhode Island was built in 1736 and survived numerous disasters and close calls throughout the years, from the hurricane of 1938, which devastated New England, to both the Revolutionary and Civil Wars. The estate at the time of building was owned by the Arnold family and would continue to be used by them for 8 generations, with many members of the family breathing their last breath in the home. The house still stands today and is currently for sale, listed at $1.2 million. In June of 1970, the matriarch of the family, Carolyn, arranged for a private viewing of what was known as the Arnold Estate, with the current owner, Earl Kenyon. The PERRON family finally purchased the home in December of 1970 and relocated from Georgia to Harrisville, Rhode Island, with their 5 young daughters in tow. Unknown to the PERRONs, the Arnold Estate had a history of odd occurrences, and the family was advised by their neighbors to leave their lights on at night, but would not go into detail as to why they felt this was important. As is usually the case, the odd activity started off innocent enough, mainly with the matriarch, Carolyn, noticing strange things happening around the farmhouse. From items and objects she had placed down moving to different locations or disappearing altogether, scraping sounds in the kitchen, and piles of dirt appearing in rooms that had just been cleaned. After Carolyn began noticing the strange occurrences around the home, the children began to notice strange things as well, but it all seemed fairly harmless. The 5 daughters of the family, Andrea, Nancy, Christine, Cynthia, and April, began noticing their toys moving around to different rooms, and as siblings do, they began fighting, thinking that another sibling had been stealing or moving around their personal items. Eventually, though, the children just sort of accepted that there was a presence in their home, and since everything that had been happening up to this moment felt innocent, the girls tried to make playmates of their newfound paranormal friends, even leaving their toys out for the spirits to play with when they weren't around. The girls stated that they felt safe and cared for with the spirits around, saying that many nights it felt as though they were being tucked into bed and kissed on the forehead before going to sleep. As the girls continued to make friends with the ghostly entities around their house, the parents, Carolyn and Roger, became more uneasy, knowing something was amiss with the house. Carolyn took it upon herself to do some research and found that there had been many tragic incidents at the home within the 8 generations of the Arnold family. From children drowning in the nearby creek, another family member was murdered at the home, and a handful of the family had hanged themselves in the attic of the farmhouse. As the PERRONs got more comfortable in the home, so did the spirits they were residing with. Roger would come home from work to find a horrible smell permeating the entryway of the home. One of the children, Cindy, claimed that she was hearing disembodied voices, telling her that there were bodies buried in the wall of the farmhouse. And eventually, the family was woken up exactly at 5:15 a.m. every day to the smell of rotting flesh across the farmhouse. Finally, Carolyn claimed to have been visited one night by an entity resembling a woman in gray who warned her to leave of her own accord, or she would be forced to drive her out. After more research, Carolyn discovered the story of Bathsheba, who had lived around the property during the early 1800s. Despite no real evidence, local legend and lore claims that Bathsheba was a witch, with the main claim being that she had sacrificed an infant in her care to the devil. Bathsheba was put on trial for the death of the infant, who was found to have died from a large sewing or knitting needle that had been stabbed into the base of the infant's skull. Bathsheba was eventually found innocent of the charges due to insufficient evidence, but was outcast from the community as a result. Carolyn was convinced that Bathsheba was the source of the more violent happenings in the home, and was feeling drained and desperate. A family friend of the Perrons was the person who contacted the infamous demonologists Ed and Lorraine Warren after the friend had visited a lecture about the paranormal. Carolyn was reluctant, thinking that no one would believe what was happening to her, and Roger was unamused, believing that there was nothing really happening in the farmhouse. The Warrens arrived for the first time to investigate in October of 1973. And despite what the movie The Conjuring would make you think, the Perrons eventually claimed that if anything, the Warrens just made their situation worse. Ed and Lorraine Warren spent time interviewing each member of the household, and unlike the movie, never actually held an exorcism in the house. Instead, they held a séance. A séance during which Carolyn was seemingly possessed. She started speaking in tongues, and the chair she was sitting in levitated off of the floor. Eventually, Carolyn claims to have been thrown across the room. Despite all of the happenings, the family continued to live in the farmhouse until 1980, a full decade after they had moved in, with the Warrens visiting sporadically throughout the years they remained in the house. But why didn't they just move? It seems like the simple solution. And the fact of the matter is, the Perron family was in over their heads. They had sunk all of their money into the 200 acres the farmhouse sat on, and in the 1970s, the economy was at a low point. The family was large and unwilling to impose 5 nearly teenage girls on any of their friends just to get out of the house, and they couldn't find a buyer for the property. The girls continued growing and eventually started moving away after high school, eager to get out of the house that had tormented them for nearly 10 years. Finally, in 1980, Roger and Carolyn sold the home and moved back to Georgia. They were ready to put the nightmare behind them. That is, until 2012, when filming for the movie based on their story, The Conjuring, started development. The Perron family were invited to the set for filming, and despite the film having built a custom farmhouse that wasn't located near or even resembled the original home, some members of the family seemed reluctant to attend, especially Carolyn, who seemed to have endured the worst of the worst during her time at the Arnold Estate. Carolyn did not visit the film set. During filming, one of the daughters, Andrea, said that a howling wind had come through the set, knocking down both film equipment and people. At the same time, in a separate location, Carolyn fell and broke her hip. The family was convinced that the wind was part of what they called Bathsheba's curse, and that despite not having lived in the house for decades at this point, they were still being followed by the spirits of the home. In 1987, a woman by the name of Nancy Sutcliffe purchased the property and refuted any and all claims that there was a paranormal presence in the home. Sutcliffe even invited the crew from ghost hunters to examine the house to prove that there was nothing amiss. Ghost hunters found doors opening on their own, as well as cold spots throughout the house, but Sutcliffe remained strong in her beliefs that there was nothing going on, whether it be benevolent or malevolent. Sutcliffe also eventually sued Warner Brothers due to the newfound fame around her home, leading to amateur paranormal investigators or just curious parties to frequently trespass on the property, especially in the middle of the night. The Warrens held on to their belief that there was something wrong with the home until their deaths, and the PERRON family also stays true to what they say happened in the home. The children of the PERRON family, who are now all grown up, still hold on to the trauma of living at the Arnold Estate and are back and forth on their desire to talk about their experiences, though Andrea did write a book based on what happened to them. There is, of course, so much more to this story, specifically the tragic backstory of Bathsheba herself, that is wildly interesting, and I implore you to do some of your own research on this case. But for now, leave your thoughts in the comments below. Were there evil entities at the Arnold Estate haunting the PERRON family? Were Ed and Lorraine Warren helpful during this case, or did they simply enrage the spirits, causing the family even more pain and trauma? Thank you for joining me for this episode of A Brief History. Thank you to my fellow collaborators on the second annual Hell House Collab. If you are a Sims builder and would like to participate in next year's Hell House Collab, please join my Discord for more information. Thank you so much to my patrons who support this series. You are very much appreciated. Stay safe, and happy Halloween.